repositories.
Okay, we are live, and I'm going to let people in.
Starter modeling process.
All right.
Okay, and Kenny's not here. Do you want to, Casper, give context to this, or do you want me to do that?
You can do that. Yeah, we are live now, and everyone is able to join the. Yeah, I disabled the waiting room.
I haven't seen Mart in a while. Hi, Christina. There's Mart. Hi. You know, I'm so over I'm not turning my camera on because I've got roots now and I look like hell. And I finally was like, I don't care anymore. I just don't care. I didn't even put on my lipstick. I have this lipstick here. I'm so over it. I've never looked at myself as much as I have since we've been like all Zoom meetings all the time now. All right, so, oh, and share. After I've eaten, I'll put my camera on. I've done that, lunchtime meetings. So, Casper, I'll let you, introduce the whole thing, right? Like, you're user group leader. I don't know if we should wait a while for more people or if you want to just go for it.
I think we can just go for it. So, good evening
Nick,
or good afternoon.
I'll put my lipstick on if you
do. Right. So, good evening, everyone, or good morning, or good afternoon, depending where you are. Thank you for joining us. This is the virtual DDD meetup. The topic for tonight or today's meetup is DDD, or creating a playbook for DDD inside your team. So the idea is that we can discuss, the topics, the techniques, the approaches, whatever works for introducing domain-driven design for your team. So inside-out approach. We discussed the introducing domain-driven design for the organization last time at DDD London. So Nick was leading that session, and I think Kenny and Julie, they thought it's a good idea to discuss, okay, how we can actually do it inside out, so we can reap the benefits of domain-driven design, even though our organization isn't really aligned with the approach. So I think that's it. I'll hand over to Julie.
Thanks, Casper. I thought it would be a nice idea to start by sharing the sharing the GitHub page on the repository. Well, the repository for the starter modeling process, because that's kind of the idea grew from there. Can you give me screen sharing?
You can do it. You just go to the bottom and say share screen.
No, it says host disabled participant screen sharing.
So when co-host, you are a co-host now.
Okay, I'll try again. Oh, thank you. Okay, so I'm assuming, can you see the screen? Okay, great. I hate that part. Like, can you hear me now? So if people are maybe not familiar with this, I hope, Nick, this is okay to share. This is kind of public, I think. That there are a bunch of people working on this repository of creating ideas around domain-driven design, of helping people, different perspectives on it. And this one is the starter modeling process. So the idea behind this is to give people kind of a roadmap about how to get people started with domain-driven design. And this particular one is kind of following a pattern that we're used to, which is outside in, right? So bringing somebody in to teach, right? How to get the team going on DDD from the outside in. And people were talking about the fact that we also need to focus on inside out, right? So if you're starting from within and, somebody on the team is learning about DDD and wants to help grow it from within an organization, maybe we should have a repository and have a roadmap and some guidance along those lines. So Rebecca, I think you're going to be capturing heuristics. So have you got some perspective on what we were doing, what the goal was today? I mean, I'm just here to lead the conversation, but
yeah,
I'm not driving it so much.
So when we're talking about inside out, it would be good for people to share two things: what their puzzles are, and it would be great to ask people from the community that's there, as well as those of us that are panelists, what their puzzles are from the inside out versus outside in. And then I think that from that, also sharing some stories about successes versus places where things didn't go so well. And from there, we can harvest heuristics. And we have a Miro board to do that. But I think it would be interesting to start out with puzzles that you have or questions that kind of lead us to, what does it mean inside out? How, depending on what my role is, do I do things differently? How can I get people to see the value of something when they've just heard, whatever. So it'd be interesting to start that way. And then we can start collecting heuristics.
Okay, so that means everybody is invited to share and participate. Turn your mics on, have a conversation. And I can get started. As a matter of fact, I'm going to start with something that doesn't happen to be DDD focus. I was participating in DockerCon last week, and during one of the sessions, it was not a presentation, it was more of a group discussion. And somebody in the chat asked about testing. The question was, how do I get my team to get interested in and on board with testing, right? And that's a question we hear about DDD all the time, right? People get exposed to DDD, whether it's from reading articles or books, or they go to a conference, but they're inside, right? And I'm sure many of us have experienced that problem of, getting buy-in for whatever practices you would like a whole team to be able to engage in. And the way I responded to that question was, I said, I think maybe the best approach is do testing on your own. I'm wondering what all the agile tester people are thinking right now. Just from my personal experience of working with people and working with teams, just do it. And then show people the benefits that you're reaping from it. So instead of trying to enable sweeping change, you can benefit from the testing and then, show this person, that person, right? And so that's kind of an inside out perspective. So I think a lot of that, we can use those same kinds of ideas for some of DDD. Obviously, if you're talking about tactical stuff, and your code and system design, at that point, you can't just be doing that on your own, because you're on a team and you're collaborating and you're sharing code, but you can certainly share those ideas. One of the reasons Kenny asked me to kind of be in front of this was because of a talk I've done a few times at some DDD conferences, which is about learning DDD a little bit at a time. And so that my approach to that kind of aligns nicely with the inside out, right? Something you can do on your own before you've got a whole like buy-in, right, from management or from your team leads or however far you want to go up, however big your organization is. So that of the way even I evolved with learning about DDD was just, I just kind of learned one thing and I didn't even learn it well, right? But I just got the kernel of the idea and I was able to take advantage of that idea. And then, I learned better how to apply it and started really seeing the value it was giving me. And I started sharing that, like writing articles and talking to other people about it. And once I had a better grasp on that one thing I started with, which was bounded context, then I was able to, add another idea and add another idea. So these are the kinds of things that Kenny was thinking about, because I talked about that might lead nicely to ideas for making some kind of a map for inside out learning. So I see that Andrew is saying 100% Julie, that was my experience too. So are you able to turn on your mic and elaborate, Andrew?
Yeah, I can.
Yay. Hi.
So I'm here because I got I wrote a blog post, which and I was working in Norway with one of, I've forgotten his name now, but the colleague of one of the people who's in this group who works in Oslo, and he suggested, because it's a similar thing. So it's about starting out in domain-driven design, because I'd kind of gone through the similar thing where I was trying to do modeling and I just do OO kind of modeling. And then I was on a big project and we were trying to solve a big problem, which turned out to be, as is now obvious, lots of smaller problems. And I'd hit the problem that Eric Evans talks about, where, you're trying to have a model which does too many things. And I couldn't do it. And then I read a bit of the book. So I went on the training, the DDD immersion course, I think the 4-day course. And that was a massive thing where I was like, if you don't stop trying to make your model do two things, have two models. And then everything became clear. And then I slowly came across the strategic patterns and all of the other stuff. But that was I was trying to model in code and with UML, actually. I think that's maybe one of my puzzles. I was trying to model the domain, and it was a legal domain in Scotland. So it was pretty complicated and pretty arcane. And we were trying to build software around that. I've since done it lots. And that was kind of my journey. I'm currently now, I've been asked by O'Reilly to turn that blog post into a 3-hour course, like first steps in DDD.
Nice.
And the biggest thing, I did some research before I wrote the course. So it hasn't been run for anyone yet. So I don't know if it's any good. It might be most people I tell think it's going to be a failure. Because it's
that's terrible.
Really, the big problem I hit was, and I've seen Alberto Brandolini talk about this as well. And I think it's the reason why lots of people don't kind of get DDD as well. They get told to read the blue book, they open the blue book, and there's lots of UML, and nobody gets UML these days. And I wonder how much people do. I kind of polled my colleagues at ThoughtWorks. I'm not sure many people even get object-oriented analysis and design, even in code, as much as.
No, and I'm going to say a heuristic I have for talking about objects or functions or whatever, and getting over that UML is just kind of what we're trying to do here, is stickies with the name of a thing and its responsibilities written in brief phrases. And you can show arrows between things and lines, but it's not the same as UML.
That's it. I wrote some polls, even in my ThoughtWorks colleagues, and I was like, how do you model? What do you model? When do you model? Who do you do it with? And what's your notation or whatever? And it was boxes and lines, mostly on their own, or to figure stuff out. But there wasn't like with domain experts or all this kind of stuff, or there wasn't anything formal. It was exactly like you said, Rebecca. So the course, if it works, I'm going to test it on Monday, gets in 10 minutes, goes past just drawing boxes and lines down into code. And then I've hopefully structured the rest so that you use the codes to have conversations with this, fake domain expert. And you can see in the code and in your tests, because I'm trying to do it a bit TDD, so you can kind of see the consumption of the objects and the calling of the functions and the naming, because I want to drive out ubiquitous language and kind of hands-on modeling. Those are the two concepts that I think are the first kind of finger holds on the whole edifice if you're going inside out.
So you're saying that let's start with intentional naming, and boy, that should match the language that the business talks about things. So it's not a technical. So the question I have is then, how do people see the benefit of that right away?
So that's a good question, and it's probably good to open this up to everyone. I am betting that, because my goal in this 3 hours is to have what looks like to the uneducated eye a kind of description of another legal domain, because it's quite a nice rich domain, which looks like it's one problem, and then hidden in there's a little bit of kind of stuff which actually gives you, there's two bounded contexts, and there's something which is called a case. And it depends on who you are and when you say it as to which model it's in. But to begin with, it looks like it's a case in a model.
Just like I found another area that's a confusing thing, but it's common in business. And I'd be interesting to hear people say this, the difference between a customer and an account.
That's what I usually use when I'm doing, just standard intro to DDD stuff. That's the easy example.
Or orders and payments, because we did that. My first DDD talk with a colleague who I don't think can make it. We did an order management system, so there was like the orders which were detailed, and then another context which was payments, and it was just a sum and an order number and stuff. And again, that's the goal is to kind of come up with the same 3-hour training, but use different, because it should work with multiple domains, right? It shouldn't work with one, because then it's about a domain. It's not about the concept of domain-driven design. So
I think that there's 2 tracks here that we can go down. One is, what information do you start with, right? And growing on that information. But the other track is about the, this inside out nature, like where does it start when you're in an organization? How does the idea of doing DDD start? Right. So I actually got an email from a guy who runs a company and says he wants to change it, like get everybody, move everybody and move their software into using ideas from DDD and a lot of things that we work with, event modeling and event storming and all that kind of stuff. So that's a is that inside out, right? Because it's still from the inside. But I think a really common thing is, one person somewhere in the organization, but not somebody high up, a developer, right? Somebody on the team, or a tester, or an architect, or somebody, but not necessarily like the CTO learns about DDD, learns one thing about DDD, or maybe just hears, keeps hearing about DDD, but doesn't really know what it is yet, or something. But there's got to be some kernel where it begins, right? And I think that's the other path that we want to. It would be good to kind of map out, like, if there is just this one person, how does this one person kind of spread the idea and get more people interested and excited about that. I'm waiting for Nick to say so. Oh, Nick, you're busy that's why you look so contemplative. You're busy on Miro.
Nick is busy working.
He's
so
working.
I actually want to bring to this group the idea of fearless change patterns by Mary Lynn Manns and Linda Rising. There's a website for that, Fearless Change. And being a pattern geek, you can listen to Linda Rising talk. She's an amazing, you can see so the point is, sometimes you want to convince more than just your team, and you are not the power person at all. And so this is a collection of patterns for how do I get people interested? And it actually, some of them, and it's not like any heuristic, like you try one thing and it works, but there's a whole set of tactical things to do in fearless change patterns. And one of the things, first of all, you have to decide whether your up for, taking an effort. That's one of the patterns is know yourself. And another pattern that I think it sounds really silly, but one of the patterns is do food. So if you want to introduce people to an idea, have let's say a mobbing session where again, have a virtual pizza these days and just talk about stuff and try something as experiments. So when people gather around something where, they can just try something out, like let's code something 2 different ways or whatever, it can really, anyway, so I think the fearless change patterns are an inspiration that I use all the time about tactical things to do when I am not in a position of power to get other people to, and I'm the change agent, but I'm not going to be able to do it without a lot of different approaches. So I can lead by example, but if no one wants to follow me, what do I do? Maybe I have a kind of a fun event in order to try something out.
So I can give you an example of something I experienced at a company when they had tried to introduce DDD. It hadn't gone well, and then I went in and used, my way of interacting with people. Mm-hmm. This was a scenario where a big company and a lot of development teams, a lot of different projects. So there were a bunch of Scrum teams on a particular project, and the architect and one of the developers on one of the teams were really interested in domain-driven design, had read things and watched videos and everything. I don't know if either of them had ever had a chance to implement it on another project. So the architect and some other leads, but not the developers, did the strategic design. They didn't include the developers when they were doing the strategic design. They did the strategic design and then brought the development teams in and said, okay, we're going to do DDD. Tried to do a quick, here's what domain-driven design is, and then showed them the bounded context. And he showed me when I got there the first day, he showed me the presentation that he had done, and I was just watching it, and he knows we've actually proposed talking about this as a conference session, but haven't gotten a chance to do it yet, and now who knows when. But I was just watching it going, oh my God, right? Because what he had told me, the reason they brought me in was they basically had a mutiny, and the developers were saying, I don't want to hear about domain-driven design anymore. I just don't want to hear it. I think I talk about this in that presentation I mentioned earlier. And so, and one of the reasons, they started by just kind of like shoving the whole thing and all of the terminology of domain-driven design. They were just presenting them with the DDD terms, like ubiquitous language, right? For me, that's always the one thing. People talk about it a lot before I really understand what it is. And so I'm also, at first I was like, don't tell me ubiquitous language because I don't understand it yet. So he had really just overwhelmed them. And then this other developer, the one other developer who was no longer there, I don't know for what reason, but they described him as a DDD zealot, right? That's a word I used once and got in a lot of trouble for, but they did. And he was, he was also overwhelming. So that really it was just a really bad approach, right? That's kind of trying to do inside out in a way, but they just totally overwhelmed everybody. They didn't do it in a gentle way. They didn't do one thing at a time. They just, everything all at once, right? And everybody it was just too much, right? And then they were like, you have to do it, right? So that's an example of an approach that doesn't work. That's
well, so
right.
So I actually think that jargon is a barrier for DDD a lot. Being someone who has a barrier myself, I'm going, this is just design. but anyway, it's intentional design. It's using the language of the business. One of the things that I remember from long ago, someone says, and this is an early Agile conference, when they said the Agile Manifesto has these inflammatory words. And to my company, I cannot tell them about Agile, and have the manifesto there, because it seems like it's, and this person was at a electronics company that makes pacemakers. And it's like, we're a very conservative company. We don't want to, so I have to take the language that fits my company's values, and then I can bring in the practices and the values. And I have to do it in a way that says, I'm supporting my company, I'm not tearing it down. So when I, have these words that people stumble over, what do you mean ubiquitous language? I'm saying it's the language that we want to speak in common for the business, and we want to have the same things in our code. Then people don't have to have this barrier. And I talk about, you could do that for almost any concept of domain-driven design. We have a set of components or services that are using the same language and fulfilling the same purpose. And oh gosh, we call that a bounded context. But so you introduce the technology, terminology, but you don't insist upon it.
So my approach has been introducing the concepts and then eventually bringing in the DDD term, because it is, and explaining that, this is what we call it. And as we're going forward and having conversations, by using those terms, then we'll all, in the same way we use the actual ubiquitous language of our domain, by using the ubiquitous language of DDD, then we know it. We don't have to stop and re-explain to each other what we're talking about. So I explain the importance of it, but not until after I've given them, they already understand what the term is.
Well, so it's interesting, because I remember back when they were introducing Scrum, whether we like it or not, it says the terminology of Scrum is not going to work in my company because we don't sprint around here, And so the question about whether, I can use the terminology that fits my company, but the values behind having a common language, having an expressive language, having things untangled, understanding in that way is, just going to save us a lot of grief and headache, and testing. All these sort of practices go together with good DDD practices, so, and modeling. But I'm not sure about the names. Do we have better names? Nick raised that question.
I think, so I just put in a comment. I've explicitly taken the names out of my training and then introduced them at the end, because there's too many things that people think they know about, but they don't, so it confuses them. And in the blog post, I said the first thing to do is forget about DDD, and then you can kind of learn the concepts and then really get to grips with it. I think that I'm less worried about the names, but I think the biggest problem with the names like ubiquitous language and things like that is just like with Agile, like you said, Rebecca, it's the people get hung up on the word, and they stop at the word. So I don't necessarily think I think we replace them, but I take the emphasis off the word and focus on the concept. That's the big thing. Ubiquitous is not just that we as developers speak the same language with our domain experts. The big thing is that goes right down into the code. So like you said, again, you can see the names of my things and the names of the functions and how they're composed together. That should almost, again, it's theoretically it might work in the course, but it's like, you know, there's a question at one point, discussion point, could your domain expert read your code and understand what it does? So they can't program Java, but they know enough that they could probably figure out, you know, what it's doing. I think that's something we forget about. We boulder in and try and kind of dominate the stage with the domain-driven design concepts, and we forget to give them the space, the domain expert, to just explain this complicated domain that we're trying to learn.
So that's one of the puzzles that I've seen. I've seen teams where some people were very excited about tactical patterns, and they went all the way in, like created over complex structures of code and so on, and they didn't bring any benefits, and people got, you know, burnt with this and so on. So that's just another pattern that I've seen, how people approach it and fail. So maybe if we can guide people how much of tactical patterns is enough to start with, so you know it's easy and safe, and which tactical patterns they should start with, maybe that's a good way to give people as a takeaway from this discussion.
I'm still thinking about that first person, that maybe, you know, maybe developer that has bosses and bosses and bosses of bosses and wants everybody to see the light, right? And wants their teams to be able to benefit from it. You know, maybe. So I'm wondering what that person's journey is, and maybe even the questions that person is asking, right? Because, you know, what questions should that person be asking? Because I think what happens is, you know, they just want it all at once, right? If there's somebody in a company and they're really interested in DDD, and they, you know, their dream is that the project they're working on or new projects coming up would follow, you know, not just DDD, but, you know, a lot of the things around DDD. Always a good, easy example is event storming. So, you know, what is a good journey for that person? What is advice that we can give that person, similar to, you know, what I said to the person who asked about testing, right? And testing is very different, you know, because you can kind of do that on your own. So that was a little easier to say, well, just do it, right? And then maybe you can share some of your benefits and successes with other people little by little. But how could that work for somebody who, you know, wants to bring DDD in? And again, Rebecca's already brought up the fearless change patterns. Maybe we could follow one, and Rebecca uses an example, mob programming, right? Like invite people there. I've got fika, we'll do it during fika or whatever. But I wonder, maybe we've got plenty of time. Can we think of some specific ideas for DDD? I mean, is it, you know, I think typical thing, but maybe it doesn't work, is, you know, kind of a lunch and learn, right? But that usually is somebody doing a presentation on domain-driven design and trying to give everybody the idea of the whole thing, right? And getting a lot of pushback, right? I don't know if anybody.
Right. So you what you're trying to say is, how can I have all or nothing? And I guess the question might be, can we do an experiment? But see, the point is, I've always cared about naming. So, but when I come to some team that doesn't care about naming, or not even about naming anything like tests, or doesn't even doing testing, how do I get traction on the value of intentional names? I have to kind of take a swath of related stories and say, can we implement these in a consistent way And if we do so, I'm going to be nitpicky about naming as we do things. Is that okay? And kind of do that. But I have to be an instigator that way and kind of be a little bit pushy. And I've done that.
I think when a company brings in somebody like you or Nick or me or, you know, one of us people who do this, right? They'll listen to us and do whatever we ask them
for
to
a while.
They're paying us a lot of money, right?
They'll do that for a while. You go away or go to another group and yeah.
But I guess my point is the things that we can do when we go in might be different than the things that
I know. So I understand. Yeah, Julie, I understand what you were saying.
Okay.
But I have seen my buddies who try to kind of introduce intentional naming, just go say, hey, and they have to kind of put their nose out a little bit and saying, I want to try this thing. And it usually is just one thing, not everything. So give me a set of stories, and I want us to be very careful about how we name things so that we can have good conversations with it. But it has to be someone who says, I want to do this fearless change. We're going to try an experiment. Let's see how it goes.
And pick a small
it might just
piece
be
of the project to just do it on.
Well, or a set of stories, related stories or something.
Oh, what was that? Something big just popped up. So does anybody else have? Oh, I'm going to scroll. Speak.
That's a question that Luigi asked. Is it a company in which employees are empowered or provided they own it? Well, you don't know until you try. If you're if you're in a company where you aren't empowered, are people really keeping track of the way your code looks at every level of detail? So if I'm within my team and I can have an influence to try something, well, I would couch it as an experiment. Let's see how it goes. We're going to deliver the stories. Let's just try it this way.
I'm seeing a lot of. Go ahead. Sorry.
I wanted to jump in exactly here. It's just perfect timing, I think. What motivates somebody to try new stuff out? What motivates a developer to learn and start and make errors and change how he works? And I think there are two possibilities. One, in my experience, there are two. One, I own the company. So it's my financial interest to have it for a long term and not making some spaghetti code and jump to the next job. And this is why I would introduce DDD, because I want to have it for a long term. If I'm only a software house selling features,
right?
I wouldn't care. Maybe if I'm the old school type, I wouldn't care, because the contract will come back to make another feature, and I don't care. And the other experience what I made and what was the best I ever had the luck to find or to build a team. We didn't own the company. We didn't own anything else about our paychecks. We didn't get more money or less money if we were successful, but we only hired people who wanted to move things, to doers. They were from juniors to seniors, every kind of persons, but all of them wanted to make changes. So all of them started to learn, and they didn't even ask, why should I learn this, or why should I learn that, or why should I change that? Because it was our pain if something didn't work, and it was our responsibility, what we wanted. We wanted this accountability and responsibility, so we did it for us. And I think this is the two.
Nice scenario to be in.
It was a great team, a great great project. And not everybody is like this. If you have a company with 50 developers and 2 wanting to become better and have some intrinsic motivation, then they will learn this. But if the rest and the culture is not to embrace learning, embrace errors, to tend to make something better, then you can have a presentation of 10, nobody would care. And nobody would skip talking about the rest, but about, they don't want to know the business. It's not my job. I'm a developer. I don't need to know the business. I think in this case, if most of them are like this, the chances are very bad. And if I wrote here for the first person, if you find one person being interested and find out why, and if he's really interested and he really want to change and really want to stay longer, then you can start a journey with him or with her together. And then you're already 2. And these persons are mostly communicative and have an influence, mostly.
Well, as an external consultant, I have to say that I follow that practice too, in that when I work with people, it's not everyone who wants to have the learning. And so it's the same for me in strategies of working with people. So it's not enough just to write code that demonstrates it, because people will sometimes look at what you say and say, well, that's nice, but
I used it for explaining architecture, explaining ideas, and having a small outlook how we could implement this cool feature or the other cool feature. And this was so exciting. Everybody was so happy. They never questioned it. It was normal that we are talking business, that we want to know what the business is doing, that we are sliding our code by the business and not by rest. we had a few real nerds, and all the discussions were changed or were dominated by the question: is it now the right moment? Is it financially? Can we support this? We moved from Oracle and Workforce to AWS and GitHub, but we had long discussions, and we had long discussions with everybody, including the CEO, if we can afford this now. Because the most important part was to be financial sure and not to play some games. Yeah, kind of the IT people only want the newest shiny stuff. And if this idea is gone and nobody wants the new and shiny stuff because it's new and shiny, but because it's a reason, and the financial reason, and a bet that it will help in the future, then one can go and start discussing business and start explaining how could one implement and how could somebody found these contacts and use these services and build them. But the first point is the motivation, I think.
I want to also bring up some of the things that are happening in chat. Luigi points out, I think that in this scenario, that person needs to understand the context first. And is it a company in which employees are empowered or can start something new, provided they own it, which, that's always, and I'm thinking about that person who isn't as empowered, and is coding and isn't involved in strategic design, whether they call it strategic, and they're probably not referencing strategic and tactical. It's more like architecture and the people writing the code. Maybe it's split up like that, but I don't know. I think I've heard a lot of people agree that the idea of defining contexts, even if they're not right, but just the idea of using the ideas of context to break down problems, to, when you're talking about a problem, maybe thinking about if, you can break that problem down. And sometimes I think that is a really powerful first step for so many people. I wonder if that, that's a nice starting point if somebody's able to do that, to bring up, the idea of, well, let's just step back and look at this problem. We're, maybe having lots of confusion about this particular thing, how to solve this thing. Maybe we've defined it. We haven't defined it right? And people might be afraid to say that, depending on their role in the company or on the team. But that might be. I wonder if that would be in some scenarios a good starting place, right? Because we're not. I'm kind of assuming, this question is not happening at the very start of a brownfield project. I always have to stop and think brownfield, greenfield. Which one is the one that nothing has ever done before, right? I figured,
green.
Pardon me?
Green.
Green, because it's the fields, and first you have to get rid of all the weeds and grass and everything.
And then stuff grows fresh and it's green. Brownfield, it's like my badly tended garden.
I get them mixed up all the time.
Yeah.
So I'm careful about mostly not using the terms because I'm always going to screw it up. But people are usually in the middle of something that's already started, right? And they maybe are tasked with, I don't know, maybe I'm stuck on this idea that a coder, right? There's a coder on the team who's learning about DDD and interested in it and wants to get other people interested in it. It's too late for, it's too late maybe for strategic design, right? But still, I still think the ideas of applying some of that thinking could be a way to bring, start conversations.
So Murat, in the conversation here, chat, Murat brought up 2 points that I think are interesting, 2 inside-out approaches that she had seen worked. One where the developer got tired of feeling what to deliver and they paired with a business person to get stuff done. And another was where the architect who has consultant-like power, I can relate to that, but perhaps less experience on the ideas, wants to try it. And actually, I think that's, you're saying a senior leader, tech leader type person who says, hey, I want to try this. I think both of those are good stories of inside out. I might say that the architect, and it'd be interesting to hear from Murat, might have had difficulty getting other people on board, even if they had consultant-like power. When they wandered away, it might not stick.
Well, that was what had been the experience at the company I went to. The architect had that power, and they had the mutiny. Was it something like that, Murat?
So the mutiny was on the side of the other people, and the architect was kind of more like looking for a way out. And the mutiny was around the architect drawing pictures all on their own and the others not feeling included. So it was more kind of like there was a bit of a pull from the problems into using some of these kind of more collaborative things. So again, it's kind of like, it's your problem, you're doing bad architecture things, we don't understand them, we don't feel we own them, we don't feel connected with them, and then seeking kind of solutions for that. So that was one of the cases.
And I think the first thing, I love the first thing you brought up, which is, somebody working on the code just said, why are we in these boxes? We need to collaborate with each other.
but they were actually in that particular case, they were very much in these boxes. Like there was like maybe 12 areas of the software, and there was always a nominated developer responsible for a single area. And it wasn't really that collaborative. So either they were all on their own or they were seeking someone to join. And it was actually a lot easier in that organization to get the person to join to be the business person and get that kind of like design related activity going on and pull them all the way to the code. So a lot of times, well, it depends on kind of what kind of frame the organization gives on how you're supposed to, like, which direction you're supposed to collaborate the most. And I find that this is maybe something that I'm challenged with in my new job. I changed jobs a month ago. So right now there's like this teams are very much in the center. You're supposed to work with your team, except then there's a bit of a specialty, kind of like within the team, the testers and developers are kind of isolated. And that's something that I'm, well, I haven't done for a while, but breaking that is something that I need to work with. But then the business people, they're kind of like, they're completely different. But sometimes it's easier to break the barrier towards the business than to the other people in the team. And sometimes it's the other way around.
I love that as maybe a possible first step in scenarios where that step can be taken, because I think if you get that, you can demonstrate the power of that collaboration, then maybe you can grow everybody's desire to collaborate across that way. Like somebody capturing that worth capturing. That might, there's not always going to be the same first step, right? But I think I think that's a really powerful first step in scenarios where it's possible. Just demonstrating, right? The whole do it, right? Do it and then explain it, right? So do the collaboration, show the benefits of that collaboration, and then, and maybe that's the starting point.
Yeah, you just said, identify the potential collaborator, find an ally, for your code.
And cool, inside out, I guess there could be so many different maps depending on who is the starting point, where that's coming from. If it's, an architect or a coder or a tester or a CTO or product owner or whomever, right? Whoever got that first inkling of inspiration. So I see people kind of moving around with their mice there. I'm watching for connections to see what's going here.
So I have a question that will change the topic slightly. So how do we apply, the notion of core generic supporting domains or contexts to this, how to get started with DDD? Because maybe some people that are willing to get started are actually working in something very generic that doesn't warrant any investment or anything like that. And I do get that there are some benefits, like, intentional naming and all these kind of things. But is there anything that we can do, as DDD practitioners to help to guide people, like when to and how to and to what extent apply DDD if they're just starting?
Do you mean to help people identify that something is generic and maybe?
Yeah, maybe how they realize, okay, I'm working in something very generic, and it doesn't really make sense to apply DDD here, but they really want to start doing that for whatever reason, right? Or maybe it is a core domain, but you are not doing, or maybe it's something close to core domain that's very important for the business, but you are not doing, any domain design here, and maybe you should. All these, kind of things, because we are. I think for the last hour we were talking from the perspective that we should be doing DDD on every single possible domain. That was my impression, and maybe that's not the case. So just playing the devil advocate here.
However, Nick makes a good point in the chat. He says, if you're in a non-core domain, that might be a good place to experiment with the new ideas in a low risk way.
It's
But
like bringing a new language in the test, right? Don't even worry about the code, but bring it in like your tests.
Yeah, being intentional about the naming of tests. Yeah.
Yeah. Or like, yeah, people used to say, if you want to bring in Scala, do it in your use Scala test, and then, you know, people can see that it's, etc.
So are we saying that people should try and should experiment no matter what type of domain they are working with?
I don't agree with that as a blanket. I think the idea of having guidance on, you know, helping people see where it makes sense to make the effort of DDD and not make the effort. However, I mean, I think, as Rebecca was saying, there's still plenty of concepts from domain-driven design that can apply and benefit everywhere. So then looping back to what Nick said, right? It might be still good places to practice them. I find, in a solution, maybe we have an area that is really complex. We really want to apply DDD and technical patterns there, but then there's an area where it's just data in, data out, but I still structure things in the same way. Like, and I just don't, get into the depth of value objects and, deep aggregates and the tactical stuff, right? It's not as deep and intense, but I still have these nice patterns that I learned as I'm applying DDD where I really need it.
So if you're doing things where you're just doing CRUD without and using a framework to do automatic validation, you're not going to get, even if you try these little tiny bits of experiment, you're going to, like value objects and whatever. And believe me, I live and breathe these kind of patterns no matter what. You're not going to get the benefits of them. So you're going to learn the mechanics and you're going to say, well, that seemed clunky. I could have just done it with a string. And so I kind of worry about experimenting where you really don't get the payoff for tactical patterns. I'm going to be contrary right now, but that's kind of what I'm feeling right now. I can have intentionally named code, but I don't have to go all the way to certain patterns.
So maybe you can identify the list of things like intentional naming that are worth doing in most of the
I think
domains.
Intentional naming, I think keeping, and these are from Kent Beck's, patterns from long ago. This is not really domain-driven design started, but it's way before that. Keeping methods or functions at the same level. So the steps at the same conceptual level. All of these sort of good naming of things, naming constants, naming tests for what it is, not, all these sorts of practices about intentional naming and keeping the code at the kind of at the same level of detail within a method or within a function. Even to the sense of like naming arguments instead of A, B, C.
So Christina wrote that she thinks that learning of how to apply these patterns can be a huge benefit, even though there is no obvious and immediate benefit to the code itself.
Well, but you don't get the payoff. And that's what I worry about is people say, well, I had to go through this extra stuff of making this value object. Believe me, I like value objects. I find uses for them all over the place. But if I don't really see the benefit.
I think there's value in seeing things misapplied, but only if you learn the lesson that you've misapplied, like you went too far, because everyone goes too far. And most people, when they start learning patterns, they're like, oh, wow, everything, and
they go crazy.
They go crazy. And I see loads of people in my job who've gone crazy and never learned, then they got promoted to be an architect, and then they got promoted above that. So they never learned that they'd made things worse, not better. So it's finding that balance between, these were good, that was too far. Like you say, naming is, ubiquitous language and correct names and stuff. That's a pattern, that's valuable. Maybe you go to the next step, but if it isn't, then you need to be able to recognize you've gone too far. So maybe that's something for this as well. It's like, something to remind people to check they're getting the value from the pattern they've implemented. Because patterns are always problem and then solution. If you don't have the problem, you don't need to implement the solution.
Right.
So I'm looking at the Miro board and thinking about how beautifully organized I don't know if I'm still sharing my screen, how beautifully organized the DDD starter modeling process is, and wondering.
It's so beautiful, isn't it?
It really
is.
It
looks like a waterfall. Define and then code. Never mind. Sorry.
Oh, it's kicking off a greenfield project, beginning a brownfield. If we could maybe even use this as a template. And I mean, I'm not saying we're going to get that done today. We're just getting some ideas out of there. But I think this is a nice template we could kind of follow and try to, I mean, I wonder where these things would apply, like, from the inside out, if you're kicking off a greenfield project. And again, depending on where you are on the team, if you're a coder or if you're a product owner, right? I think these things are going to be different. It's going to be different. The maybe some of the fearless change ideas, right? That are going to depend on where you are in the team, how much say you have, how much power you have. But regardless of that, then bringing in a lot of the guidance that we're capturing here too, like intentional naming, like don't overemphasize technical or tactical patterns. Don't shove a bunch of DDT in people's faces. Oops, I didn't mean to move that. Or, so I think you might come up with a couple of different sections, right? One is how do we start DDD? Like, how do we have these conversations? How do we get the ideas to other people? And then a lot of points of guidance that would apply no matter which path you're on, which tactic you're taking.
So while you were speaking, Julie, there was two, and before as well, actually, when Rebecca was speaking, and actually Christina and Mara, there was two kind of images that came to mind. There's kind of like beachheads or toeholds, like the first, because you might try things like Rebecca said, you might try and fail, but you don't want to try a massive thing and then, use all your political capital with your boss's boss. But a little thing, and it maybe fails, and it's, small experiments. And then the other thing is kind of like milestones or beacons or something that you're aiming towards, which might join back up with the other thing that, that Nick and everyone's already produced. Because you are aiming to get somewhere big, but you want to take small steps, but you need, you want to focus these small steps on this kind of this bigger picture that you're aiming for. And those might be two kind of ways to organize lots of the things that are on the Miro board. And then you could also, you could share from the community, people could share other, here is another scenario that I found myself in, and we tried this and it worked. But the reasons it worked were we had a business domain expert to pair with, or we had a boss who was sympathetic, or we had spare time so we didn't have to go fast, or maybe.
So Andrew, at the beginning, you told your story how you got interested with domain-driven design, and I think that was very useful. So maybe there are other people that had interesting stories how they got started. Maybe they can share, because that way we'll be able to relate and share it with other people. like how you got interested in DDD. At what point you realize, okay, that makes sense and we should apply it here? I'd be interested to hear other stories.
Let me share my story. So this is Renan speaking. I think that my personal story started with just picking up the air about the domain-driven design for a number of years, but not having an opportunity to apply it. So what we ended up with at my previous company is starting a book club. We picked up a fairly light book by Vernon, the Domain-Driven Design Essentials, distilled. And during the book club, it's fairly easy to read. And we had about 5 guys who went through. We were hoping actually to have a significant more impact and have a larger presence from different parts of the company, but we ended up with having only 5 guys who actually, some of them had more experience, some of guys like me didn't have much. So we went through about probably a month and a half, maybe 2 months total, because we were not kind of doing this weekly, it was every other week. And I think that's how I jump-started. I think that the grassroots way of doing things through the book club is one way to start kind of building the awareness inside the organization. Although I understand its limitations, because basically those who are actually coming and joining the book clubs really already have some interest of sorts. They just need to have some structure how they can spend eat the elephant in smaller chunks. And the book club framework and process really sets them up for to be a better, to go through the content that may not necessarily they may not necessarily understand or may not have time to do that.
I like the story. Thank you for sharing that.
And I added
I think
to the Miro board. I like that. Just a grassroots initiative within, instead of just thinking about, okay, it's one person, right? You've got 5 people.
So a lot of these are actually part of the fearless change patterns. The more I hear these stories, it's like, find your allies. One of the other patterns that I think is interesting is they have 2 patterns. I'm going to talk about them. Develop an elevator pitch. And that may sound kind of silly, but it's the 25-second benefits of what we're doing. If I want to do DDD for a particular whatever, why do we care? So hone your elevator pitch so you can say it over and over again. And then there's another one. If you think that people need to be told something that are in positions of power, where you're disagreeing what they're saying about the way that you're working, you don't call them out in public, but you may go and whisper in their ear. Have a conversation. That's a pretty it takes a lot of courage to do that. But let's say your architect is, getting things screwed up or whatever. You want to go talk to that person in a way that you do it without doing it in public.
Also, one of the things that we're trying to get DDD inside my company right now, it's finding out the pain points, because it's pain points from where, let's say, sales process, and use something that is familiar. I would agree with Nick that you should stay away from the terminology that triggers people's triggers people too much, like in domain-driven design, but instead use the sales process as something that they're familiar with. And that's, for example, one of the things that I think that event storming is a really good fit, as well as the techniques that can expand from the event storming and domain modeling into the other areas too that are very of great interest. One is UX. And second one is the product management. So getting, once you have these allies, this is my strong belief that you're creating a full force that kind of can propel itself faster. And if you introduce the techniques from the domain-driven design toolbox, I know that people don't necessarily like the idea of the toolbox, but still there is. We all have tools, nuts, bolts, and everything else into the mix. And then once you identify, you see that they're working, you can say, okay, guys, we actually use this approach, and this actually, how it actually fits into the puzzle. So instead of trying to do this big bang change and introduce DDD as from different fronts, find out where it hurts the most, apply what is appropriate, and then identify how it actually fits into the bigger puzzle for the process, the one that, for example, we identified in the DDD starter kit.
There we go, unmute. Renat, that gave me, triggered something. I was at one conference where I was talking about DDD. It wasn't a DDD conference. And somebody asked me, how do I get people, especially higher ups and management, interested in domain-driven design? And at that point I said, I don't know. I always start with people who are already excited about it. That's who I'm usually working with at that point. But I was headed to Explore DDD, the first instance of Explore DDD. So I said, I'm going to be, somewhere where there's a lot of people who could probably answer that question. So I asked around, and every single person that I asked said event storming. Do an event storming session. Now, the thing about event storming, though, is when you're doing, that first chaotic exploration, the guidance is bring in somebody external and experienced for that, right? Because it's tricky and there's a lot of psychology, et cetera, going on when you're doing that. But there could still be, you could just do an experimental one, right? An experimental event storming session if you can get buy-in. And usually, that doesn't have to be a day, right? Like so many of us have done event storming. The same company where I went in for a week after they'd had the mutiny, they scheduled during that week a 2-hour event storming session. And a man who was, he isn't CTO. I mean, it's a huge international company with offices all over the world. So there's a lot of people. So he's not CTO of the whole huge thing, but his role was something like CTO of that whole organization. And he came in and spent 5 minutes of the 2 hours there. And that was it. And he also was there when I did a short intro to domain-driven design session, which was for anybody in the company who wanted to attend, as opposed to the teams and project teams I was working with during the week. So that was the only interaction I had with him, or exposure he had with what I was doing. But he was there for 5 minutes during the event storming. And when I left there, he said we had kind of a retrospective at the end of the last day, and he was there also. And he said, from now on, any new project we are working on, we start with event storming, and we're going to use domain-driven design. That was like, oh my God. But that power of what people can glean and see and witness the collaboration and everything that happens in a well brought together event storming session that can be, what is that guidance? Maybe it's even for, I think it was from Alberto, which is, just tell people, come if, just commit to staying for 5 minutes, right? If after 5 minutes you're not interested, leave, no big deal, right? And so there, that might be something if you've got, enough buy-in, that could be the mob programming, right? The food, do the food. And instead of mob programming, maybe do some kind of event storming if you can get that. But you kind of need to know what you're doing. That's the only thing.
So there was a question in the chat that says, and Nick kind of said, don't do it in a high risk situation. So I'd like to hear Nick tune in a bit, pardon the pun, about what high risk. So sometimes it's things to avoid are useful too as heuristics.
So what's a high risk scenario? A high risk scenario is where you make a big deal about event storming. You convince people it's going to be very successful and popular. You then get 20 of your company's most senior people all in a workshop for half a day or a whole day. And then you don't get any good results out of it. Or you've got lots of big personalities and they're all trying to push in different directions and you haven't done event storming before and you don't know how to deal with it. That's going to look bad on you probably, and it's probably going to crush your chances to do it again in the future. So that's what I call high risk. And one of the heuristics you can look for is, how much is this meeting costing me? Like, how many people are here? What's their pay grade? How long is the workshop for? And then think about the expectations. What are they expecting from this workshop? And think to yourself, how confident am I can deal with all these personalities, introducing a new technique I haven't used before? So very often people will make out that event storming is this super cool technique. You're just putting post-its on the wall. It's deceptively simple and deceptively dangerous. So just try and get some practice starting in a small group first. Even on your own, that can be beneficial. Just try on your own, in your own bedroom at home if you have to. Just get an idea of the different kinds of patterns, how to lay out post-its, the order in which things happen, and even just doing something basic like that can prepare you. And then just having some kind of a script to work from for your first time. One of the benefits of event storming is we can go in many different directions. But when you're doing something for the first time, and it's such a variable activity with so many possibilities, many of the directions it can go in are bad and negative, and you want to avoid those. So for the first few times you try event storming, and any technique really, if it's complex, working from a script that you can work through in a certain order can give you some guide rails. And then once you become experienced, you can kind of throw those guide rails away and then go wherever the technique takes you, because you're comfortable and you know how to deal with problems when they arise. It can be problems in the domain, with the people, anything really. So that's what I mean by high risk.
So I hope that it didn't sound like I was suggesting that, but I think it's really good to be really, really clear about that. I was, I did certainly preface it with, you should bring in an external person, but if you could just do a little half-hour easygoing thing, not bringing in super high-level people, but just people around you. Anyway, but I think those warnings and caveats are really, really important.
Yeah, your advice is good. Once you get the hang of event storming, it's a very powerful and very versatile technique, and it is simple when you know how to use it and you have some experience. So the advice is good. I'm just throwing a caveat out there.
Yeah,
often people can think event storming is easier than it actually is, and you don't realize what can go wrong. So just having some preparation there can help.
I actually still have a book that my own notes that in my notebook that I bring with me when I do event storming sessions. And I just, make sure that I'm feeling like, because I can get distracted and whatever. And I just kind of flip in there and just make sure, it's my own way of having my notes for it.
And
anyway,
the more you do event storming, the more you meet other people who do it in a different way to you. And the more you realize there are just billions of ways you can do an event storming session. And it's not simple. And there's no right way. And it's one of those things where the more you learn it and practice it, the more benefit you can get from it. And it's really not simple.
So bringing in somebody to guide event storming is not really inside out unless it's triggered from the inside and you convince somebody else to make that happen. But that's not really.
You might not need to bring someone in. I would always try and not bring someone in if it was my recommendation. Try on your own, try in small groups of people, try with someone who's not working in software, who's approachable. Like Rebecca was saying, who's your ally? Make an ally. Find someone who could be an ally. Show them it works. Like one technique you can use is you can say, I don't really understand this part of the domain, to a domain expert. Can you explain it to me? And can we just use Post-its? You don't even say it's event storming, and then they realize because you're asking one of these questions, and they're having to explain the domain in a way they haven't explained it before. And they're probably learning things themselves. And they can see how they're teaching you in a very powerful way with these Post-its. They might be thinking, wow, if I could teach everyone in the team this way, my job would be a lot easier. And then you've got an ally.
So it's kind of interesting, Nick, what you just said there about people telling you stuff about the domain. I've found helpful just talking to people and having them tell me stories. And they kind of are surprised that I want to listen to their stories because I come in as the technical person. But what's interesting also when you get people to tell you stories, if you start asking questions, then they can say, oh yes, and then this happens. And they really, 2 hours later, you could be having a conversation that's like, wow, I guess it really is complicated. I understand a little bit why you software folks, are having some, because they've been used to giving you things in terms of user stories and little tiny bits, and you don't put it together. That can be a very interesting conversation to have with people.
Yeah, and you just touched on my favorite event storming heuristic there, which is don't model, tell stories. So event storming is about creating narratives, about very concrete scenarios. I don't know if you ever met Eric Evans. I know you have, Rebecca, but to everyone else, I don't know if you met Eric Evans before, but he's always like banging on about, give me concrete scenarios. Like concrete scenarios you can work with. When you get into the details of a specific story about a specific user on a specific journey with very specific pieces of information, that's when you uncover the complexity. When you stay high level and you talk in very abstract terms, there's lots of complexity that's hidden in your domain there. But the stories get you that complexity.
Yeah, there's two things that made me think about so the talk that I mentioned in chat that my ex-colleague Gayatri Thiagarajan and I have done, we did it at DDD Europe. Exactly what Nick said. If you're too high, everything looks the same and you need to get into the detail to be able to distill out the differences, which is where you get the breakthroughs. The other thing is, and the slide we get most photographs taken of when we're presenting is MVP. MVP and domain-driven design don't like each other because lots of people, because they come at this with the world of stories these days and they're thinking MVP in the smallest slice, they miss the richness of the domain because they speak, like Rebecca says, to the domain expert and they're like, don't tell me about that, I just want to know about this thing. So they block out the detail that will give them the access to the richness of the domain because they just want to focus on this one tiny story. which they need to build in 3 days. But you can still do stories. You just need to say, tell me about the domain, and then we'll figure out which bits we can slice it up into. If you lose that depth of detail, then you can't do, no matter how much access you have to domain experts, in my experience, you're not going to get this. You know, it'll end up looking like a CRUD system again with a bunch of, you know, occasional business rules. So letting those conversations happen is massive.
So to extend what you just said, the example I like to give people is that, like, no matter how many examples you give me, I'm not going to build a Google search engine just by seeing the box and you tell me example of this search query and the you know, the results. There is whole rich, you know, model underneath that handles that. That's why we need to explore it. So 100% Andrew.
I actually think this questioning and asking storytellers is very much like what exploratory testers do within the system. You know, you're querying what is with this sort of open mind of like, and what happens next? You know?
Yeah, 100%, Rebecca. What's amazing to me, having done this a lot, is how many people we get into the room when we do things like event storming or just DDD, and technical people, including architects, who've never spoken directly to the business. It's always a surprise to me as to how much they learn from doing even just a little bit of any of these techniques. They're like, I had no idea that's how the business works. And you're like, you built software for these people for 10 years. How do you not know that that is how they work? And then the domain experts will be like, yeah, we work around that every time you build a system because you never ask us, so we never get a chance to say that we do this. And that's really interesting.
And also I spoke to some product people that told me, like, yeah, it's easy for me to get engineers interested in domain-driven design and so on, but it's super hard for this product people to get other product people engaged and interested. So I think that might be another thing that, you know, how can we help the product people to get in, to introduce them to domain-driven design, for them to see the benefits of aligning, you know, the business and the technical people and so on.
Well, so they've probably been writing little stories in little slices and finding it very frustrating.
Okay. So we need to find their pain points and address them.
Yes, because like, okay. Oh, you guys just don't get it. And like, oh, we need more. Yeah.
Yeah, ThoughtWorks UK, the biggest, lots of tech people like event storming, loads of the product people like it, because it gives them, they can talk about stuff and ask questions, right? In context with the business. And in context is the big thing. Because technical people like to tell them to shut up and not worry. No, don't worry about that, we'll build that later. Watch this little bit, and they get to see the whole thing.
In my experience, we are their pain points. The developers are. And in this team, we just asked the sales team what the clients are saying, what are their pain points, why are they signing and why not? And then we found out stuff I never thought about this, never ever. And they were extremely happy and thanks to us 1,000 times because they were never asked. So we were 3 developers and 2 people from sales, and they were much happier as we were happy, but they were delighted that we asked them. And I never understood why are they were they not asked, because they know what the clients want and why they are jumping up and not signing.
I mean, that's the best bit about the page you showed before, Julie. The fact it starts with business model canvas, which to most technical people couldn't be further from their job at all, is exactly the right place to start, because most of them don't even think that far. I think it flips it all on its head. I think it's really useful.
I've had people be really shocked, but in a happy way, when I suggested inviting customer service reps to, you know, to event storming for that same kind of reason as the salespeople. And they're like, oh, I never thought of that before, right? Like, so that's good eye-opening, right? Just to get them thinking about that. Give them those, you know, thinking about where those collaborations might be able to happen. Not just necessarily from, you know, not always the business people and the coders and the testers and the product owners. There might be other people too. Oh, what are we going to do next now that we have this big Miro board?
Hopefully we can save it somewhere.
We can create a new repository on the DDD crew if you like. Could put it together there. Create a couple of pull requests.
And then, Caspar, are you proposing to have the repo for the picture or for what?
No. I mean, like, compile the information that we put on the Miro board. Because I feel like if we leave it on the Miro board, we'll look at it for the next couple of days and then we'll forget about it. I think if we could compile like a short README for people that want to start and they are part of the team. I like the idea that someone mentioned earlier. Okay, from the perspective, okay, you are a developer in the team. These are the things that you can do. You are an architect. These are the things that you can do, and so on. If we could put it in a repo and share with people, I think that would be immensely helpful.
Yeah, but I think it belongs to. You don't think it belongs to the starting kit?
Can belong there.
Just
like, yeah, if we can put it there, if you think it fits there, we can totally add it there. If we think we want to, have a separate document for, starting with DDD in general from like inside out, I'm open to ideas. I think anything that contributes and makes it easier for people to learn is good.
I think this is the smallest problem, where to put it.
Yeah.
The biggest is how to consolidate it. Cool.
Maybe if you're going to put it in the same repo, then maybe start it as a branch just to see how it works. No?
Christina,
you're muted. You disagree.
I have an issue with branches. it won't break anything. It will be okay.
Right, it's not code.
We have a board, we can decide it. The biggest issue is to consolidate it, to put it somehow together and then make an elevated guess. And the first one decides, I don't know. The question is still how to consolidate it to have it useful. This is my biggest question. Besides talking about this, which was very interesting, and it's very cool to hear stories and experience and share experience. It's perfect. But how can I use it? I don't know if I can go to a list and look, okay, in which cell I am now, which is my table. What can I do?
So Christina, that's actually a very interesting point. I've been thinking about some kind of, I won't say decision tree, but I have this sort of branching about, am I here? What do I do next? What are some options? Where do I go? I'm on this, so maybe that's something we could work on as a way of presenting it, because I think you kind of need to know what paths you are on in your context. And here are some ideas to try these things.
Yeah, sure, but this is so different. You're mostly, not you personally, but most people are talking about, just an example, architects and coders. And in my world, there isn't any difference in between this. And we had a cool mobbing session with Nick and Hyun, and we had totally different words for leads or something.
Interesting.
And this is why it's hard to put this thing in a table, because it's not black and white. We could describe the situation like, if you are somebody who is in the IT and has a lot of influence, or you want to have, or you could have a lot of influence, then you don't have the title, but it doesn't matter.
Right, it's your situation.
Yeah, the situation. If we could describe the situation, then I think it would be already a help, because we describe a general situation. We don't say you are an architect or you are not, and you are not allowed to.
Yeah. So I think that context or situation, it might be a good way to do it. And I still think of it's sort of like, am I here, but I could try this or this or this. It's not just one thing to do. Yeah.
Okay, this feels like a plan.
Yeah, I think that doing this as a role-based approach, basically think about, instead of having a decision tree like one process, you can have more of a mind map with several entry points that says, as an architect, as a developer, as a tester, I want to do X. How can I enter into this mesh? And then what are the paths that I can go to? And that may be probably a more interesting approach, because it can allow people give people different perspective, but in the meantime provide the context of how these things kind of are connected to one another.
Yeah, one other thing I'd steal from my product colleagues, just sometimes these are the get, or these are the way, you know, you can get here, or you know, this scenario fits you. Listing ways it you know, things that don't fit, or you know, you will fail at this if you don't have access to a domain expert, or this will fail if you've only got a week, or you know, things that will say fail fast by meeting these criteria and then try something else is quite good, because otherwise people will be paralyzed with choice. So you can kind of say, right, there's a lot of options, but this won't fit because you don't have a lot of spare time, or this won't fit because you aren't working in this kind of area, or whatever. So people can narrow things down.
Very cool idea. We need constraints and failing points.
Right.
As long as we don't build an expert system that does the purpose of which would be, okay, how to apply DDD in your organization.
So I see the similarity between just what we talked about and patterns, you know, because there's usually a context for a pattern and forces that you have to balance, like for good or evil. But it's not the same as a pattern. But I think those constraints that you have to balance and who you are and what your situation is all sound like interesting gates for some of these activities.
I think there's also something, Rebecca, like you said, that there's a life side, because this is the thing I think gets talked about less these days in domain-driven design. People don't realize it's a journey or a story. They don't realize they're to go somewhere and then learn and fail, like Christina said. But by failing, they discover and have a breakthrough, and then they keep going. So a kind of story, or, you know, like some time scale type aspect, or, you know, you will go here and then you'll go too far, like we talked about with, you know, applying too many things, or you will go there and it will be hard and you'll have to start again. But these are parts of the journey. There isn't like a quick way through.
So that's a very interesting point. And that's about learning anything new, whether it's agile testing practices or exploratory testing, or, you know, whatever. So, but that kind of expectation has not, somehow people think, oh, I can just learn all these things about DDD and event storming, and boom, there I go. Maybe people are perpetual optimists.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. Then the problem with DDD is there's so much, and then you get overwhelmed. So you don't understand all of it. You have no idea how to pick which of the 300 ideas just to solve the one problem you've got.
Is this a heuristic somewhere? which one to start?
Well, there are lots of heuristics. This board is full of heuristics.
Yeah.
Where to start?
The thing in lots of communities, like they had the same thing in the Scala community. There was tons of stuff if you'd reached the 10th rung of the ladder, and it was amazing. If you were on the bottom rung, or you were on the ground, there was no, there was very little. People weren't up in the, on the second floor throwing ladders down to people. And that, one reason, like, this person I knew was big in the Scala community, and that was, could be like, I don't know if people are in the Scala community, but there was at one point there was a disinclination to bring up people who didn't know how to do this. But I think this feels good to me, because we do want people to, like, these are the bits. You can forget about 90% of this stuff, because it's just, these are the three things that if you get these, then you're on the journey, then you're going to get to the next step.
I think this gets back to why Kenny had originally reached out to me when he was thinking about this, because the session he saw me do, this is exactly what I was talking about, which was, you know, you can learn one, you don't have to be the whole big expert. You don't have to know all the things. And this is controversial in places, right? Because there's danger of people saying, okay, we're doing DDD and then doing it all wrong. Like me, I started with the idea of bounded context, but it wasn't really bounded context. It was just, I took the idea of boundaries, right? I started with boundaries. Then I started realizing, oh, this really isn't bounded context. And I started understanding better about bounded context, which allowed me to, right? But just using boundaries was beneficial to me, right? So, and I wasn't saying, oh, I'm doing DDD. I've just said I found this great thing that's helping me, right? So I was really benefiting from it. And then, you know, each step of the way. The pushback I've gotten on it, though, was, you know, I really think it's from people who just didn't get what I was saying. I don't know. But the pushback was, well, that's really dangerous because then people are going to do terrible things all over the software. But I was like, well, they're not going to do it any worse than they were doing it before, right? They're not going to do worse things, right? So like everything stays the same, but some things start getting better, and then more things get better, and then more things get better. So I think that's an important thing for people to understand, that it's okay to not worry about, like, I have to read and totally comprehend the blue book from end to end before I use any of this, right? I can find things that are powerful to me and useful for the team and start implementing that. And then that, you know, you'll always want to grow that knowledge, because it's exciting to see that happen. Hey, I just thought that was looping back. So do you think we're done? I mean, you know, we don't have to do this for 15 more minutes unless other people have input. Thank you, Andrew.
You're welcome. It was very good.
I think we can wrap up. All right. Thank you, everyone, then. I feel like we should have someone that is going to, you know, make the next step and put it somewhere, or at least be a leader for that, so that we can action that. Do we have any volunteers? Because I think we produced a good thing. It would be a shame to, you know, to forget about it.
So for the next week and a half, I'm very, very, very busy with the XP conference and bunches of things.
So what would be the ideal next step, or the easiest next step for us? What to do with this Miro board?
I think the next step to start fleshing something out in that or a separate repository, in the starter modeling repository, based on these things.
We might not be at that stage yet. Potentially, okay. we could have another meetup where we split into groups, and each group picks a persona, as Rinat was talking about earlier, and then each group starts to define some what we're calling them, flows, paths for each.
I like that.
Each persona. I think it would
scenarios and paths.
Yeah, I think it would be good to do that in the collaboration phase first, because I think that's the kind of thing where it needs multiple people's input to clarify the personas and the paths, and then it would seem ready for the documenting stage.
Okay, yeah, because as I was saying that, I was like, where would one even begin? So that's smart. Nick smart. Well, I can commit to doing work, you know, finding an hour or two with a group of people to attack one of those personas?
It could be the next meetup like this. We just split into groups and attack the personas.
And the next meetup is?
I think whenever we want it to be. Yeah, there are no, I'm just looking at the virtual DDD website. There are no meetups planned at the moment.
Yes, there is.
At
There's
least
one for June 17th.
Oh, sorry. So it's not published then.
Okay.
Well, I know there is a lot of meetups that are being discussed. I don't see any of the meetups being published, but I can get in touch with Kenny and we can.
I've accepted that one.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm seeing something.
I'm not Kenny, so sorry, I don't have all the context and info.
Yeah, but I think there's one on the 17th.
Okay, so I don't know, week after or
sure,
the 17th, something like that.
Sounds good. I will have done a first dry run of my attempt at 3-hour training course, so I can back on that and I bring that to the table.
Cool.
Unless it fails, in which case you'll never see me again.
Oh no, you need to tell us why then.
Like a lot of ways it could possibly fail.
Oh yeah, it's just not on there yet. It's funny. You sure that wasn't a DDD Europe thing, Rebecca?
Yes, it's not.
Okay. All right. Yeah, because I'm just looking. I don't see it on here yet. All right. Okay. So
we already have helper hands. Just look in the chat. And maybe we can answer this last question. How can somebody contribute?
Come to the next meetup.
Okay.
Yeah, it would be nice. It would be nice if we had an offline channel for posting these ideas, and there is such a place. If you're interested, there is a DDD CQRS Slack group, and there is a virtual DDD channel in there. So if you have any ideas which you really want to share, or you want to get feedback before the next meetup, I recommend you post those ideas in there.
Maybe we could capture some of those things in the notes, in the comments for this meetup for others. Because there was a lot of people signed up, so they might see that. Yeah, maybe in the, where is it? I don't see a way to comment. Maybe it's, oh, it's because I'm not signed in here. Yeah, maybe we could put that, would that make sense? Just to, in the comments for this meetup, just put a link to the Slack and just to say to watch for the next scheduled meetup.
Sure, and I also pasted that link to the Slack channel into the chat.
How is the Slack channel on GitHub? Oh, it's
Is there a repo for previous
it.
meetups recording or something? There is a channel on YouTube. Minali. Sorry if I didn't say that right.
Yeah, I think if you just go to virtualddd.com, there's a link to the YouTube channel. Am I right?
In YouTube is a link to the YouTube channel.
Oh, there's Slack and there's Twitter. Yeah. For example, the original one of these meetings. Yeah. So all the YouTube links are in the virtualddd.com site. All right. Anything else? Casper, I'll let you.
No, that's it. Okay, thank you, everyone. I'm going to stop the live streaming now. Thank you for your contributions, comments, and ideas. I'm excited that we will be working on this again in 3 weeks, hopefully. I will follow up with Kenny and make sure we get it scheduled.
Great.
Okay.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Cool.
Thank you,
Thanks.
everyone.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.